Hello, everyone, and thank you all for taking time out to be here on this warm evening. We are so happy with the response to this session as we've almost hit 400 registrants. Wow, thank you all for supporting our programming. The handout and resource page will be sent to you soonest. We'd ask that you hold your questions for the end. You can use the chat box, but please direct your questions to chat with all panelists, unless you are comfortable sharing your questions with everyone. CES is pleased that Jory has made time to share his knowledge with us. He has the experience of working frontline as a school mental health therapist and was also a supervisor, guiding other therapists for the toughest cases. Jory is also well known for his humor and engaging demeanor. We will have some time at the end for questions, but just don't ask him if Star Trek and Star Wars are the same thing. Welcome, Jory.
Thank you very much, Wendy. So, hello, my name's Jory McMillan. 400 people, wow. So officially there are more people coming this than to my wedding, which is an interesting comparison because, that was a very important day for me too. So today I'm going to be talking about anxiety and support strategies for it in the classroom. Funnily enough, I always start with talking about what I'm not going to be doing in the presentation. One of the things that I don't do is I don't spend a lot of time going over diagnostic categories of any of the different types of anxiety disorders. The main reason I don't is that in the 16 years of supporting student mental health in the school setting, I've yet to have a parent or teacher tell me that knowing the difference between, say, generalized anxiety disorder and a phobia is helpful in the moment when they're trying to support a child. Secondly, I'm not going to be talking about why anxiety disorders exist or why anxiety disorders are potentially becoming more common. Part of the reason for this is that it's a pretty big and broad topic, and that it would warrant its own presentation or a book, let alone a presentation. Oh, my PowerPoint isn't being shown. Just a moment. I'm wondering if I'm not sharing screen. There we go. First technical difficulty encountered and fixed. Hopefully people can see my PowerPoint now.
Yeah, we can see it.
Awesome. Thank you. So if I was covering why anxiety might be becoming more common, it would be its own presentation. And on top of it, to the best of my knowledge, there's yet clear no consensus in the field around this issue as to if it's becoming more common and why. And this was before 2020, 2021 and the pandemic. So now is a lousy time to be studying anxiety in general. So what are we going to do? Well, first, we're going to discuss how anxiety is different from fear and how that can impact the thinking of someone who is experiencing it. We're also going to discuss ways that you might be able to identify the presence of anxiety in your classroom. Part of the challenges with anxiety is that anxiety can present in many different ways and shows up wearing many different faces. Lastly, we're going to go over some concrete support strategies and tools that may help a teacher or parent support a child with anxiety. My rule of thumb with support strategies is that if it's something you have to do in the moment, it's a 1 to 2 minute intervention. If it's a strategy that's designed to be done proactively before a child might experience anxiety, my rule of thumb is 10 to 15 minutes of conversation for that intervention. I got a really simple rationale for those timelines. In a busy classroom setting, a teacher's got to monitor the curriculum. They have to make sure that behavior is being contained so you don't have Lord of the Flies breaking out. You've got to support students in general. So on average, their time is really limited. So these interventions that are in the moment are designed to be delivered when you're kneeling next to a child's desk, when you're walking beside them, during your supervision of the playground, or during a preparation class or lunch recess. Now, What I've been told often happens is that as I describe symptoms and struggles with anxiety, people will actually start to think about children that they know, children that they've taught. Uh, I love this because it actually can be quite useful because it provides an opportunity for you to think about how you'd apply some of those strategies that we'll be going over in a while. And it also gives us a chance where at the end of the presentation, I always leave some time where we can discuss application to specific examples. So if any kids come bubbling up to the top of your mind, please keep them there because we will have time to talk about them if you have questions. So the first thing I want to do is discuss just my personal definition of fear versus anxiety. Now, fear, it's a physiological and emotional response to a readily identifiable external threat or danger. Anxiety, anxiety is a physiological and emotional response that arises from a pattern of thought as a person thinks about the past, present, and future consequences based upon their interpretation of past, immediate, or potential events. Now, normally, if I'm doing this live, this is where I get a whole bunch of teachers looking at me going, wait, what? What does that actually mean? Well, if I'm experiencing fear, I could be scared of a barking dog or a person threaten me or be in the process of being humiliated by a verbal putdown. However, with anxiety, I can be anxious about wondering if that dog over there is ever going to get out of their yard. If it's even out there, if I'm trying to take out the garbage, if that person over there might threaten me at some point, or about laying awake at night, doubting that anybody would really like me if they knew the real me. So, why is this difference so important? Well, since fear is a response to a visible or immediate threat, it's relatively easy to know when to not be afraid. After all, the cue is not there anymore. The dog is behind the fence. So, an example I often give to children that I worked with is to think about a person being confronted by a saber-toothed tiger, say about 40,000 years ago. So, that person, when confronted by the tiger, is probably going to do one of three things. Uh, they might look at the saber-toothed tiger and think it looks reasonably well fed. Uh, so, that person might decide to freeze, hold still, and hope that it doesn't eat him. So in this example, the saber-toothed tiger passes him by, and our ancestral human has a moment of intense fear, and then will begin to calm down once the tiger's out of sight and he realizes he's not on the menu. Or our ancestor may look around and evaluate their surroundings. They may reason that they're nimble and agile and have a better acceleration in the short term than the tiger. So with a quick sprint, they head for the nearest tree and up they go. They flee that situation. After the disappointed tiger stops rampaging around the bottom of the tree and goes away, our ancestor will have a moment of intense fear and most likely start to return to a calm state as they head back to the rest of their group to discuss their narrow escape. Perhaps our ancestor sizes up the situation, grabs their spear or club, and decides that the best option is combat. So they go with the fight response. After a heated exchange about who's going to eat who, say our ancestor is victorious and they head back home with a new rug. So, in this way, with the child, I've covered the flight, fight, and freeze response that all people have in life threatening situations. Now, here's the thing, I've had the odd perceptive child point out that it's possible the tiger might win. And proof that sometimes doing therapy with really smart children is creates its own challenges. I respond, however, when given this scenario, that yeah, this is a possibility, but when was the last time you had to worry about a saber-toothed tiger? And they go, well, no, it hasn't. I'm like, yeah, when was the last time I had to worry about anything eating you? And I point out that one of the realities with a fear stimulus is that you might not always be able to remove it right away. But over time, it's sometimes possible to learn to manage those situations in a way that the actual danger can be reduced. So, for example, if you are fearful of drowning, you can learn to swim. If you're worried about something eating you, you can make sure that there are none of them left around you over time. Fear, unlike anxiety, often has a concrete solution. So, however, to explain physically what it feels like to have the flight, flight, freeze response, I have to delve into my own history. Now, I have had the enormous good fortune to be married to the same wonderful person for 27 years. Now, before you start trying to decode my age based on the little picture you have and the vibrant timbre of my voice, I'm going to say that if someone hands you the keys to a Lamborghini at the age of 19, you don't go shopping for another car. You just figure out how to manage the insurance payments. Secondly, I live in Alberta and it's very dry and very sunny, so sunscreen and lots of hydration. However, just because I had the enormous good fortune to meet the marital equivalent of a Lamborghini at 19 did not mean that I was a good driver. Like many young husbands, well, come to think of it, less than young husbands, I've been known to make the odd mistake in my relationship. Now, I'm going to go on record that I did not forget my first wedding anniversary. I did double book it. Through some sort of odd mental gymnastics, I'd somehow created two parallel evenings. Now, in one of them, there was this romantic dinner for two at a wonderful little Italian restaurant near our apartment. In the other, I was playing Dungeons and Dragons with my friends. Now, I'm watching the weather on my wife's face as I explained to her this rather humorous conundrum from my viewpoint. And I began to see some ominous signs that she did not share the same humorous outlook at this situation that I did. And I noticed that my heart began to beat faster. I felt a slight sense of nausea as blood left my gut to go towards my major muscle groups, which were potentially getting ready to climb a tree or run away. My skin started to feel cool as major blood vessels and groups closed down and blood retreated from the easily wounded surface towards muscle groups that might help me battle a saber-toothed tiger. Adrenaline surged through my system, and my thoughts became faster and more chaotic as I began trying to process environmental data as quickly as possible. Now, that sensation in that moment, that was fear. Now, everything worked out after some somber reflection and a certain amount of negotiation with my 20-year-old frontal lobe. I informed a wizard, thief, knight, and barbarian that their resident druid would not be available to help them storm the evil wizard's keep that evening. And my wife and I instead had a wonderful dinner. Now, ever since, I have remembered my anniversary every year, May 31st. However, I do find that 2 to 3 days before my wedding anniversary, I have an echo of those same physical feelings that struck me the night of my first anniversary. Though long ago forgiven by my spouse, I still have these symptoms and worries from that moment, despite the fact that there's no external stimulus to justify me having them anymore. Now, that's what lets me know that those feelings are anxiety, or in my case, a amount of small t trauma. So, why is this distinction between fear and anxiety so important? Well, consider, what if there's no visible cue that lets you know you can stop being afraid? For example, what if you're so worried that poor marks on your next test will permanently damage your future to the degree that every test becomes a nightmare? That a good mark in the face of that anxiety is so small and disempowered that it loses its ability to provide you with any sense of validation and reassurance. What if you were so badly teased in the past that you find it impossible to relax in social situations because you're never sure it's not about to happen again? That you were so affected by a car accident that every car ride becomes an anxiety-provoking experience? This type of fear is actually anxiety. It isn't caused by something outside of you. It's being caused by something inside of you. And that's what can make it as hard to recognize for the person who's feeling it as the person who is trying to support the person with it. That's why telling someone who's anxious to calm down or that there's nothing to actually be afraid of is so seldom effective. It's much, much harder to stop a thought than it is to change something in your immediate environment. So I often get asked, okay, so how prevalent a concern is anxiety? Well, according to the research that I've looked at, there's an estimated range that somewhere between 3 to 8% of all children will have some feelings of anxiety that are considered intense enough to meet the criteria for having anxiety disorder over the course of their schooling. Now, does this mean that every time you see worry or concern by a child that they have an anxiety disorder? No. And this is the only time I'm going to talk diagnostic categories. One of the hallmarks of a disorder, whether it's physical or mental, is that it has a sustained negative impact on functioning to the degree that it negatively impacts your functioning, right? So everybody's going to have transitory feelings of sadness, worry, anger, distraction. And often these feelings can easily be traced back to day-to-day life events that, sort of legitimately invite that reaction. It also does not mean that 3 to 8% of students in your class will have an anxiety disorder. These studies report that people will meet the criteria for an anxiety disorder over a period of time. So if 3 to 8% of children were reported to get the flu over the course of a year, you're not going to have that number in your classroom showing those symptoms on any given day. You would be safe to assume that 3 to 8% of those children would take sick days over the course of the year. So a way to think about it is this. In the classroom size of 20 kids, at least one child would experience an anxiety disorder over the course of their schooling, either past, present, or future. By the way, if I'm doing this face-to-face, this is normally when hands go up and a teacher in the audience gently explains to me that 20 students in a room is not an average class size. So what are you looking for? What can anxiety look like in the classroom? Well, there's a fairly big challenge with anxious behavior for children in that anxiety can present in a number of ways. So let's start this way. I'd like to invite you to think about all the times you've been stressed out or worried. The last 2 years in the pandemic appear to have given us lots of opportunities and grist for the mill for this exercise. Think about a time when you've been worried or feeling on edge and you reacted to someone in an irritable or angry manner. Or perhaps you just overreacted where your irritable response is an 8 out of 10, but the stimulus, when you think about it, you calm down, you're like, oh, maybe that was only worth a 4 out of 10. Think about a time when you've been preoccupied and concerned about something and you forget your keys. Or you're searching frantically for your phone only to find it for some weird reason tucked into the pair of shoes that you put in the closet an hour ago. Or you get back from a grocery trip and realize that you picked up everything but the one thing you went out to pick up in the first place. Think about a conversation that you were dreading having and how successfully you have in the past put off or delayed that conversation. They were probably times that you were successful in forgetting the necessity of it if you were worried enough about it. Lastly, I'd like you to try and think about a time when you were genuinely afraid to do something that someone was pushing you to do. Maybe it was to talk to your boss about a promotion or to finally go see a doctor about that mysterious ache or pain. I'm betting there were times that you argued pretty strongly against and dismissed fairly firmly that that action needed to happen at all. And this is a challenge for looking for signs of anxiety in children, because it can look like a lot of things. Anxiety in children can look like absent-mindedness, forgetfulness, defiance, anger, reluctance, avoidance, or tears. The risk of this is that sometimes an anxious child can be labeled incorrectly as defiant, willful, spacey, spoiled. So if you're going to be an anxiety detective, let's look at some of the common physiological signs that go with anxiety that might help you notice if a child is anxious. As we discussed, the flight, flight, freeze response has certain symptoms that go with large amounts of adrenaline coursing through our system. So you can see like stomach aches or nausea. And it's possible that these symptoms might resolve really, really quickly. Like this would be the gut ache, that it's really, really bad, and then the kid goes home and it disappears. Or it might be a headache that does the same thing. Whereas an actual physical ailment would normally lessen over time. Maybe you're going to see sweating or muscle tension or shaking. You might observe headaches, that come on through stress. You might see even dizziness or shortness of breath, because the highly anxious child may be breathing quickly and shallowly. Uh, you might notice a lot of jumpiness or easily startled children. Uh, One of the things that I think is particularly difficult for the socially anxious child is often you're going to see a lot of upset stomach or gastrointestinal distress, for really anxious kids, which I think is, when you're worried about social anxiety, the last thing you need is to be gassy. But what are you looking for with how they think when they're anxious? Well, there's some cognitive signs that you might see in a kid that their thoughts are preoccupied with lots of anxiety. So, one thing, anxiety often invites you to think about the worst that can happen. So, you might see like a super pessimistic outlook, or that a child is always convinced that it's never going to work out. You might see a distracted child or preoccupied child, or you might see a child that always seems to catch the one detail in a situation that would cause anxiety. I often marvel at how good my daughter is at spotting spiders that I otherwise never would have seen. And it's because she's terrified of them. She finds them. Um, you might meet a child that has such a high standard for what's acceptable when it comes to their work that they may destroy their own work at the slightest mistake because it doesn't measure up to their own internal standards. Or they may become so focused on doing something the right way that they never actually start doing it. Or they're so focused on the way it needs to be that it's virtually impossible for them to function in group projects because they can't tolerate the lack of perfection with other kids. There may be a person that, despite being reassured that it's not a competitive element for their class or sports team or workplace, they're always fretting a bit over what their placing is with regards to the rest of the group. And see, anxiety can form this cognitive filter over social interactions. Someone's walking down a hallway in a crowded school with a scowl on their face, and the anxious child may see that person as judgmental or hateful to them. Otherwise, innocuous events and social actions may become threatening and personalized when translated by this anxious preoccupation. Because anxiety is so concerned about our own welfare, it sort of makes us the most important person in the world or the center of existence, when in reality, we're not. One of the things that I've talked with many kids about is when they talk about that kid who scowled at them in the hallway, I'm like, that person who was scowling in the hallway, have you had an interaction with them before? No? How many kids go to the school? 1,300? That kid probably doesn't hate you. They probably don't anything you. They were probably thinking about something else that was upsetting to them. Um, Anxiety can sometimes create this false cognitive burden that situations are always about us or always our own fault. So, what's the experience of anxiety? Well, a lot of the times that when I'm asked about this, or when I ask this as a hypothetical question to people, they respond with something like, well, I guess I'd be anxious, or I guess I'd feel nervous. But what I'm always struck by is when I talk to children about the experience of anxiety, the language they use is so much more rich in meaning than those words. I've had it described as people telling me, imagine having someone standing right behind you or right beside you, talking loudly and persistently in your ear. And sometimes you walk into a room and turn a corner and you realize they aren't there, but then that voice shows up again. And they always seem to find you at a time you least want to hear what they say, like when you're trying to concentrate on a test or join a group of peers. And I'm like, well, what do they say? And they say, well, it's all these constant warnings about every bad thing that could happen. Um, it's like this shrill voice explaining, like, okay, this is the bad thing that's going to happen right away. And then this is the bad thing that's going to happen long term about this mistake that I think you're going to make. Um, or they tell you all the bad things that could be happening to your loved ones when you're not around, or to you when they're not around to protect you. Um, they will micro examine every little social mistake that you could have made, and they'll point at it. They'll replay that tape of every social interaction you've had and scrutinize, what did that kid's face mean? Why did you say what you say? Um, and then I say, well, what's the impact of that voice on when you do something right or when you have a good moment? And kids tell me that then that voice shifts to starting to devalue what you did, tell you how it was a fluke, or tell you that the fact that you could do it sort of means it wasn't that hard. You're probably going to mess up the next one. And you can try and build yourself up, and people can try to build you up. But there is this constant critical voice that you, or worried voice, that you always have to combat. Now, one of the really challenging things for kids is if they've had the situation where they've been anxious from a young age, often that voice is their normal. It may have gotten to the point where they have trouble seeing the difference between what that critic says and what they themselves think. So when they tell me what it feels like to be anxious, the words that they use aren't, well, I feel anxious or nervous. They say things like, I feel stupid, I feel worthless, I feel bad, I feel picked on. They tell me, oh, it feels like I can't make any decisions because every choice is scary, because I'm always thinking, what if? Um, and they talk about a lot of the, and people will say, well, what if you do this? And what if you've done this? You've done this before. And they say, but that's only because I absolutely had to. And the whole time I did it, I would rather have been doing something else. Like, yeah, I look calm, but my heart is pounding and I'm sweating the whole time. And that's when they mean when they say avoiding attention or enduring situations with dread. Sometimes they're forcing themselves to do it. When I think about the power of the word dread, I try to think how seldom I use that for myself in my own life, going, well, I dread doing that. Anxious kids legitimately dread doing a lot of things that they're scared of. So what are some of the behaviors that you might see in an anxious child? Well, here's the thing. Avoidance is a hallmark of anxiety. So you might see a lot of procrastination or verbal agreement to do something that is somehow never followed up by actually doing it. I once worked with this really polite and incredibly anxious young man, and he learned if he said yes and then sorry, respectfully, he almost never had to do the things that terrified him. In the short term, this was really adaptive, and it was a freeze response because the saber-toothed tiger would sort of pass him by when he said, "Yes, I'll do it. Sorry, should have gotten to it." And then when the saber-toothed tiger noticed, hey, you didn't do what I thought you would, um, he would just repeat that tape. It drove his teachers nuts for a while. Um, One of the things I talk with people about is I say, well, I don't know if your neighborhood is like this, but my neighborhood right now is full of rabbits. And what I'm aware of is the amount of rabbits I don't see. Like, think about it. How many times have you been startled walking by and suddenly a bird flies away, or a rabbit runs because you get too close to it, or a squirrel suddenly goes up a tree? For every one of those animals you see, probably you've passed 5 or 6 at different times that were freezing, waiting for you to go by. Holding still in the face of anxiety is actually short term a really adaptive strategy. So often, what anxiety can look like is the absence of behavior. The kid is very shy, they're quiet, they never put their hands up, or they never answer a question. You might see the need for constant reassurance. A child frequently checking in with you that they're doing things, the right way, even after being explicitly told there's no right or wrong way. These are the kids that come back to your desk 2 or 3 times to check that they're doing it right. And also, these are the kids that sometimes struggle with open-ended questions, because anxiety finds open-ended questions or assignments based upon expressing opinion to be stressful. 2 + 2 = 4 is always the right answer, whereas an opinion essay or reflecting in a book report what you've taken from it, that's not nearly so cut and dried. So you might see resistance in the face of having to do things, assignments like that. Sometimes you can see behaviors connected to the physical response of anxiety in the body. You might see lips that have dried out and been licked or chewed to the point they chap. You might see gnawed upon fingernails or chewed shirt collars or sleeves. You might see some pretty big behavioral outbursts. I knew one young lady, she was really anxious, and she'd figured out that if she threw the equivalent of a verbal hand grenade at her teacher every once in a while, she'd be sent down to see the principal, and she would much rather do that than the classwork that she knew in her heart she was convinced she couldn't do it. Part of anxiety can also at times be really leaning into a need for routine or set patterns of doing things. It's just less to think about if you keep it the same, which can be reassuring. And I often think of substitute teachers for this symptom because they are so much at risk of triggering it. They literally don't know the right way to do things or the preparation a child may need to do the right things from their perspective that their regular teacher has long ago mastered. And sometimes when you're going into a classroom, they may be able to warn you about one or two kids that have particular needs, but they're not going to be able to fill you in on all of them. So at this point, people are normally feeling a little depressed because they're like, okay, this sounds like a really tough place for a kid to be, and how would we help with that? Well, we're going to move into that right now. One of the things I say is that all the following strategies that I'm going to talk about have the potential to support a child with anxiety. However, just as in saying, well, don't be anxious about it is not an instant fix, none of the following ideas that I'm going to give you are the equivalent of a silver bullet. But with consistency and compassion, most of these have the potential to help over time. So you can help a child plan and rehearse for future events. One of the best replies to what if can be if then. So anxiety really thrives upon uncertainty. And while it's not possible to remove all uncertainty from life, we can remove a lot of it. If possible, you can reduce these surprises in a child's life by warning them about transitions and schedule changes. For some children, a visually posted schedule can reduce the worry and need to ask questions because the answer will literally be right in front of them. When is gym happening? And it teaches the kid to go and look themselves. Sometimes it's easier to forget or lose track of things when we're anxious. So having organizational aids, such as a well-organized binder or backpack, can really help. What's awesome is now every single kid with a phone has a built-in day planner that they can use, and that can help for the calendar. Part of it is you can also help them plan for stressful situations about helping them focus on what they can control and contribute versus a potential outcome that they can't control. So telling a child, don't worry, it won't happen, is seldom effective if they're worried, but talking with them about what they can do in that situation often is. So I recently talked with a young man, an intelligent boy, handsome, takes after his father, who was worried about having poor answers to questions. Said young boy, with that. Now, he was worried about giving poor answers to questions in an upcoming job interview. While it was tempting to like reassure him or give him potential answers, it was much more effective to ask him what questions he was worried about and discuss how he could answer them. He expressed this worry he might not be able to get the job even if he answered everything exactly the right way. Well, rather than telling him everything was going to be fine, I asked him if it was possible to guarantee the results of any job interview or just guarantee that he tried his best. I sort of pointed out that if he was interviewing after another qualified applicant who happened to have pulled the interviewer out of a burning car earlier that day, it's reasonable to assume he might not get the job through no fault of his own, right? So, okay, he allowed that it's only within, his control to do his best. He then expressed that he was a little worried his mother might not, might be disappointed if he didn't get the job. Now, instead of insisting that his Lamborghini of a mother would feel no such thing, said Lamborghini, I asked him to think about what she'd shown him in the past about how she would react if he didn't get the job. And he thought about it and he realized that she wouldn't mind. She'd be disappointed for him, but not in him. So this conversation is an example of a 5-minute intervention that happened while the adult was doing something else at the time. In this case, driving him to his job interview. Now, here's the thing. Fortunately, the employer clearly recognized the really good parenting and craftsmanship that had gone into this young man, and he was successful in getting the job. But that is not what I praised him for. He didn't really have any control over being hired than he had control over being 5 inches taller than his father at the tender age of 17. Praising him for getting the job is a little bit like praising him for being tall. He might not have had much of a say in it. What I did praise him for is I praised him for being brave enough to go in and interview in the first place, and stated I was proud of his effort because that what was under his control. In this way, I'm reinforcing something that he can do that is actually correlated with long-term success, namely if you're persistent and determined. So another thing is you can provide a child with safety, security, and reassurance in the event that they become overwhelmed with anxiety. Asking a child why they're choosing to be stressed out or anxious is another example of a generally ineffective way to support them, in my view. This child probably didn't get up in the morning and go, you know what? Yeah, I think I'm going to lean into my anxiety and give in all day. They normally aren't happy about it either. There is a large invitation to mirror what we see from another person in our conversation. So here's the thing. If a child is presenting as a fearful or worried person, you can already start to help by reflecting back calm and reassurance. You can be collaborative with them when discussing how to navigate an anxious situation versus being insistent that they have to. Telling a child that you are there to help them and you will be supporting them in doing this is often more effective than telling them that they must do something. Here's the thing, stress tends to overload our brain. If a child is showing signs of stress or anxiety, keep your sentences short and simple. Check in with the child, clarifying and confirming that they understand. This may need to go beyond, do you understand? Do you get what we're going to do? Because that invites like a yes or no answer, which may not actually tell you if they understood. You can go with something like, so what have we decided to try so far? How will you know that you need help? This is a question that they may actually have time to think about before answering, which will tell you more about what they understand about how you're trying to help them. Many times I talked with teachers and parents that they're really frustrated because they just endured an anxious event with a child. There was a storm of tears or verbal defiance, and they wish it hadn't happened. I think this really speaks to the care that most of us have for children. We want them to be happy, right? However, I've always been struck by a parent or teacher's ability to start to be able to analyze the circumstances that led up to those events and those storms. And then if they allow themselves to sort of examine that past instead of wishing it hadn't happened, that past then can become a gift in unpacking the present and having another plan to go forward. They can start to learn, okay, how can I avoid this or help the kid reduce this in the future? Here's the thing. Many of us can benefit from grounding or physically calming activities when we're anxious or frightened. There are breathing exercises, guided meditation clips from the YouTube or phone apps. You can do gentle physical exercise, or you can have a safe place to go when you're worried. You can have distraction aids like noise canceling headphones, white noise generators, gentle music that they can listen to. These are all things that can help a child calm their mind as they calm their body. Be aware of that fight, flight, freeze response. I was once in a school where I knew the principal fairly well. And so I go in, and one day I'm really surprised because there's a cardboard refrigerator box laying on its side on the floor in her office. And a door had been cut into it. And I look in, and there's a pillow and a mattress. So I'm starting to look around her office for signs that she's been living there. Like, does she have a toothbrush in her coffee cup or something like that? So before I could say anything to about her, I hear these running feet, and I felt like this rush of wind at my back. And I turned around, and I just had time to see this child go right into the box. And then this arm comes out and pulls the door shut. And the box just starts to vibrate a little bit. So I looked at my colleague and sort of was like, elucidate what's going on. And she just said, okay, come on, and to the hallway. And she explained to me that this kid had a history of trying to run home when they were anxious. And at their age, this was actively dangerous for them to do. They were not old enough that they could be on their own running out. And so she knew this kid always went with flight. She'd given them a place to run to that was safe within the building. I thought this was brilliant. A key part to figuring out the support plan you want to put in place for this child depends on what you have to work with. My colleague happened to have a box and some floor space and the willingness to have the kid show up in her office. I've seen other schools and home find similar in principle but different in delivery solutions based upon who is available in the building to help and what is the layout and resources of that building. What often happens with anxious kids is if they've started to overwhelm your own resources in the classroom, that's the time to go to administration and see what's possible and what resources are available. Now, I've seen similar fixes again and again. I've never seen a prearranged like fight zone for anxious kids, but I have seen come and tell me when you're mad working in helping control explosions. One of the best interventions I ever saw a principal did is a principal sought out a kid that knew was anxious and tended to go with loud arguments and said, you know what? I'm the person that's going to try and help you when you're in trouble. I wanted to meet you when you weren't mad or when you weren't upset because you're important. And I just want you to know that when you have a bad day, I'm here. And I wanted to shake your hand before you'd had a bad day. The kid actually started, they did not arrive calmly, but they actually started arriving at that principal's office. I've never seen a go here to freeze place, but I've seen many children learn that they can tell or signal a teacher or parent that they're starting to get scared before they completely shut down. My colleague with the refrigerator box had also taken into account another factor. An anxious child is seldom going to want to give up a control of an anxiety management strategy that works, even if it has some long-term problems like never going back to class because you're in a box. So her refrigerator box was a sanctuary that the child could go to for a little while, but it wasn't a permanent home. It was a refuge that they could calm down in, then talk with her about what had happened and form a plan so they could go back to class and try again. And if they needed to come out, that was okay, because they would form another plan and go back again. Anxiety is really frightening for kids. They may not let go of a maladaptive way to cope until they trust you to support them when they are frustrated. Help them deal with excessively high negative expectations and fear of negative evaluations. There's this young woman that always comes to mind when I think of this. She was 14, and for her, the high expectations were in the area of academic achievement. She regularly got 80s and 90s, and it was the result of a lot of hard work and a really intelligent mind. And she was not satisfied with excellence. She was going for perfection. She wanted to improve her marks by 1% on every assignment. And I asked her what would happen if she got like 100%. And she looked at me and said, well, they give bonus marks, right? And this is where I had to be careful what I was mirroring her, because she said that. And I was like, and then I'm like, yeah, even when you get 100%, it's not going to be enough. Oh, we've got to work on this. And then she had, even if she'd gotten 100%, she would have been worried she couldn't maintain it. And she had another anxiety inviting belief that mistakes were unacceptable, that they're the sign of failure, that not just a process, but of the person who made them. And that sometimes speaks to me that sometimes, believe it or not, success can invite this fear, because one of the penalties of being really good at something is you have limited experience managing the times when you don't get excellent results. So I actually had to ask for permission to tell this story at my 25th high school reunion. I approached the guy that it's based on and said, this story it has helped a lot of kids. Is it okay if I keep telling it? And I told him, and he said, yes. So my classmate Bobby, he was this, it was back in grade 5, and he was popular. He was a really good athlete, and he was super smart. Actually, I was always sort of a little jealous of Bobby. And one day I heard someone crying in class, and I was like totally stunned to see that Bobby's in tears, like he's just broken down in the middle of class. And when I found out why, it was because he'd gotten a 67% on a French test. Now, to him, this was the lowest mark he'd ever gotten. It was incredibly upsetting to him. To me, getting 67% was a good mark in French. It was better than I normally did by a long shot. And then even at 10 years old, I had this sort of realization that there was one thing I was better at that Bobby right then, namely getting 67%. Now, what was interesting is Bobby always continued to have a lot of academic success. He turned out great from everything I can see. Never again did a mark that low bother him. And he did get the odd one later on, but he did have that intense initial anxiety because he'd never dealt with it before. Now, here's the thing. High expectations, it can be challenging for adults, parents, and teachers. We're sort of acculturated to think that high marks or exceptional results will guarantee good results for children. And as caring adults, we may push for what we see as good things. However, at the end of the day, the thing most associated with success and happiness for children that they can control is determination and resilience. So normalize mistakes as inevitable learning opportunities. Encourage the kids to think of how they played the game or prepared for the test, rather than if they win or what mark they got. Be careful with your own language by modeling positive self-talk. Change "I failed" to "well, I didn't do as well as I would have liked." "I'm stupid" to "I made a mistake." Honor their strengths and evaluate their successes by what they have shown you that they are capable of versus a goal that you can hope that they're going to attain someday. At the end of the day, that old cliche of it doesn't matter how many times you go down, it matters how many times you get back up. It's true with regards to anxiety. A child learns to accept imperfection and uncertainty and to persevere regardless of the results they get. That kid tends to improve on their own naturally. Sometimes to be supportive of a kid with anxiety, you have to challenge their thinking versus helping them problem solve. There are many times when anxiety can invite a kid to minimize their successes and accomplishments. So instead of helping them problem solve by how to do better next time, challenge them to see or hear them, if you see them or hear them discounting or minimizing what they've done. Don't let them write off their successes to chance versus effort. And this is tough because as humans, we're wired to notice when things are wrong. It's much harder to notice and give a quick validation to them doing something right. Challenge those unrealistic expectations, whether they're social, academic, or vocational. When dealing with unrealistic expectations, ask, do you think it's possible that everyone would like you? That anybody could be liked by everybody? That it's possible to always get it right the first time? That you will always win? When it's time when it's time to problem solve, bring the child in at an age appropriate level for sure. But most importantly, during that problem solving process, normalize that part of your process is you're going to be circling back to talk about how well it worked because it will not have worked well or completely the first time. You might have to problem solve the same problem a dozen times with many setbacks before we get it right. And if a kid hears that as an expectation, it does normalize that imperfection is acceptable. I have some purely academic accommodations for anxiety that come out there that teachers have shared works over the years. One of them can feel a bit like a step backward because one of the most exciting things to hear and one of the biggest signs of understanding is in education, from what I'm given to understand, is when a child starts to be able to give their informed opinion versus sort of repeating memorized facts. However, here's the thing, open-ended opinion style questions can be challenging for children with anxiety because that very lack of structure that allows for creative answers can fill a child with worry that they're not doing it right. So providing more structure and closed-ended questions for a child who struggles with anxiety, that could be a place to start. Timed exercises can be very challenging for some children with anxiety. the worry is that they will, of course, run out of time. Having children with anxiety know they can have extra time to do a test will often reduce that worry, and that makes it easier for them to concentrate. This often has the happy consequence that uh, a child will often not actually need that extra time. They just needed to know they had it if they needed it. Model anxiety management. There's a lovely line from the graphic novel The Crow. And this is normally when people can guess my age, because a lot of you probably haven't seen this movie. It was a great movie from the early 90s. But the quote is, "Mother is the name of God on the lips and minds of every child." There's also another cliche that if the boss isn't happy, nobody's happy. To me, both these speak very strongly to an essential truth. We are really influenced and impacted by our attachment figures. I can remember my wife driving our Jeep Cherokee down this wintry Saskatchewan back road after dark, and I'm in the passenger seat, and my then 18-month-old son is in the back. We encountered a porcupine in the middle of the gravel road unexpectedly. Now, my spouse is a good driver and she's a good mom, so she made the decision that she wasn't going to swerve all over the icy gravel in the dark to miss the animal, and she just really hoped that the porcupine would duck under the chassis. It didn't. There was a bit of a thud. Now, here's the thing. I've gone hardcore with freeze, and I'm doing a very good statue impression in the car, in the passenger seat. My wife slows down the car, brings it softly, safely to a halt. And then when she checks that we're all safe, she bursts into tears because she'd been frightened, and also she loves small animals. Now, what was interesting is that was the final straw for my son. He'd been quiet during the whole initial gasps or fright, the shuddering of the car, the thump, the quick stop. But mom crying over something, that to him was the emergency. Anxious children need the appearance of calm from their attachment figures, even if it's just that, only an appearance. By modeling anxiety management, you can both create a soothing effect for the child while showing them how to stay calm, even when it's a tense situation. And here's the thing, kids with anxiety are often convinced they're the only people who's ever felt that way, that no one else is ever bothered by it. So within the appropriate limits of your role with a child, you can talk about times that you were afraid and how you handled it. That often gives the child just a sense of validation and normalization, and it starts a conversation about potential things you can do. There's some common techniques that can be tried with children, many of which are based on physically, calming the body. These can be like distraction or grounding oneself in the present. Like other previously mentioned support strategies, none of them are guaranteed to work the first time. Like most skills, they take a bit of practice and coaching to improve their effectiveness. Also, here's the thing, different kids may respond to different things, so it's okay to have them know that you're going to try different grounding strategies and we're just going to pick which one works the best. So if we remember that brain-body connection and how that impacts flight, fight, freeze, we can see that as our anxieties, as our body's level of agitation goes up, those anxious, sensations in our body will creep into our brain, and sometimes those anxious thoughts in our brain can creep down into our body. Slowing down and calming our bodies through muscle relaxation is a good way to begin calming our minds. I challenge anyone listening to take a warm bubble bath and to experience the same level of stress that you were feeling prior to getting to those bubbles. The weird thing about the pandemic is with 400 people, there's every chance that somebody out there is in a bubble bath. So let's start talking about breathing then. When we're anxious, our breathing tends to speed up and shallow. Any quick search of the App Store or YouTube, you're going to have a multiple examples of breathing exercises, but the basic premise of all of them is the same. You want to slow down and deepen your breathing along a counted rhythm that will time your inhale, holding the breath, and exhale. Now, here's the thing, like any skill, perfection is not required at first. I once had a serious discussion with a kid that just because they'd seen a yogic breather doing it, having 2 breaths a minute might be a little much for a beginner. There's also the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding technique that's easily researched, where a person notes and states 5 things they see around them, 4 things they can touch, 3 things they can hear, 2 they can smell, and 1 that they can taste. And they can always taste their own teeth if they get stuck on that one. Um, this helps pull a person into the present and provides distraction, and that can help calm you down. Sometimes even pushing your heels firmly into the ground when you're sitting can have a similar effect. They're distraction and mindfulness activities that you can find in any app store now or download. Coloring activities, relaxation activities. Saw a really good one where it's a slime simulator for your iPhone where you can drag your finger through and make patterns. These are all excellent ways to distract yourself. I've got a couple closing thoughts before we go to questions for folks. So here's the thing. I've often been mistaken, in my view, as a frontline worker for children. The truth is, I haven't ever seen a child, ever, that wasn't identified as potentially needing help by a concerned adult in their life. And the truth is that most of the time, the person who's brought that kid to me is an expert in that kid. Teachers see kids in different contexts and more of them than most other adults. You see them in unstructured social situations. You see them trying to do social studies or math in a busy academic environment. You see them at the beginning of the day when they have energy, or after lunch, or towards the end of the day. A school can at times have a really accurate reading on how a child is doing. So here's the thing. If you have doubts or worries about a kid, compare notes with other teachers. Is this child having global academic problems that could be related to anxiety? Is it getting better or worse? Do we think the child needs additional supports? And parents will always have a unique insight into their children that no other person can match. You watch them grow, you see how they act when they're well rested or tired or cranky at the end of the day. You are often the person that they can drop their mask around, because if they know you're safe to fall apart around. So if you're seeing a worrying trend over time, it may well be an indication that your child could benefit from support. Trust your observations. Another thing to consider is kids may need you as an adult to confront and support them in their experience with anxiety. I've had a lot of people going, how can I help the kid realize they need to do this? Few children or teens say to themselves, you know what, I'm feeling scared. I'm really starting to avoid this. I'm betting if I keep avoiding this stuff, it's going to have a long-term impact on my scholastic and life development. I'm terrified of doing this right now, but I really need to push through this thing that terrifies me so it won't affect or limit my option in my 20s. That thought process is just not developmentally normal for people who haven't completed adolescence. Children with anxiety do best when they have systemic and unified support from as many concerned adults in their lives as possible to provide encouragement and gentle, firm motivation to move forward against their fears. Anxiety, well, it's scary, but like any other problem, there are answers and solutions to them. It's my hope that today's presentation provides you with a few potential ways to help the children in your life have an easier time with their saber-toothed tiger appears. Because who doesn't like a nice rug?
Wonderful.
These are
Thank you, Jory. And sorry. Sorry for interrupting. Go ahead.
no worries. I was just going to say these are the cited resources, and then I'll let you speak to the more module. Wendy.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'd like you to direct your questions, please, to all panelists. We've got a lot of questions coming in right now. Jory, can you just back up that more slide?
Okay, wait. I will.
Well, in the handout you'll all be receiving tomorrow, the link to the more module, where you can take a more in-depth dive into what Jory has just covered and see some videos as well. Here it is. Oh, there, no.
It's on a
There it is.
timer.
Yeah.
That's
Oh, that's why.
there.
Oh, it's on the timer. Okay. All
Yeah.
right. In the handout you will receive tomorrow, you have the link to the more module. We invite you to go watch it. It's wonderfully done. So please, here comes the questions. Let's start with this one. I viewed the more module earlier today and found it so useful. We will use it for our next PD day. My question is, how do I talk to teachers about their anxiety in the classroom? My grade 8 came home last week saying how stressed out his teacher is. What can I do as a principal to help the teachers?
Oh, that's such a good, I love that question. Actually sort of gives me feels to hear a principal caring about their teachers like that. Because it's hard right now. I don't think teachers have ever had a rougher go than they've had over the last year. Um, I think part of it is that here's what I've seen principals do in the past. One is opening it up so it's acceptable to have a conversation about it, to speak to it, to sort of voice a gentle curiosity and concern. I'm noticing this. I'm wondering how you're doing. Um, I think you can do the problem solving with an adult a lot easier than you can with a kid. But I think the key is normalizing that anxiety and normalizing that it's support to it. My experience is I think a lot of teachers feel a tremendous sense of responsibility. And I think sometimes that may promote a bit of independence and trying to be strong for their students and not realizing that the benefit of a team and talking with each other can be that mutual support. Certainly helps me as a social worker with my colleagues.
All right. I am from BC. Can you offer this presentation to our school here?
Uh, that is an excellent question. I know that Wendy, can they folks in BC can access more, right?
They sure can. They sure can.
Okay, so
Yeah.
so the, sorry, go ahead.
No, well, this presentation is being recorded, and so far everything is working technologically wise. So if you are registered, you will be receiving the link to the recording tomorrow.
Mhm. I would say if something went wrong with that link and you weren't able to access it, um, potentially if you contact CES, I could see if I could do it at another time.
All right. What are your thoughts on mindfulness, and can you recommend any apps?
Okay, me personally, I really like the Mindshift app because it has some guided mindfulness exercises in there. Um,
I'm going to post the
mindfulness,
breathing room app as well. I like
ooh, that's
breathing
a good
room.
one.
Yeah.
Oh, and for the believe it or not, for the younger kids, for like grades like I'd say 1 through 4, there's actually an awesome Sesame Street breathing and mindfulness app where it's actually animated with like the Muppets, so it's super cute for the adults who are using it. But that one, it's so good with kids, and that's also in the iStore, and those ones
Fantastic.
are free, by the way. Um, but the question was mindfulness. Well, mindfulness is sort of being found as being extremely useful for dealing with a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety. It is one of the things that it takes practice and effort to integrate it sustainably. And also for younger children, they normally need sort of support in guiding it. Um, it's funny, in the moment I'm thinking of is one of the things that's sort of really normal, say in kindergarten, is nap, right? Everyone gets that 5 minute sort of like centering, where they, okay, like let's lie down in the dark on our little mats and they just have like a 10-minute lay down when there's music in the background. And there's really no equivalent for that as we get older. But I've seen the odd teacher be able to integrate a mindfulness activity into their classroom as part of their curriculum. Um, Actually, funny, like my son's advisor at his school, homeroom advisor, does a similar activity where it's a conversation and then it's a guided relaxation at the beginning of every day. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question or not, but that's my opinion to the question.
All right. How can I help my 17-year-old in grade 12 who is worried about getting into university? He feels he is not resilient enough to endure more online learning.
I think there's a lot of that going. I guess my curiosity would be as to talking with him about what the what exactly he's anxious about getting back and getting to university. Is it that he's worried he's not able to do it? Is he worried that he's going to be stuck doing learning online and be ineffective? Does he feel that if he delays going into university, that he's going to be damaging the trajectory of his life? Does he feel if he makes mistakes, it's going to permanently, get in the way of him being successful in school? I'd be curious as to sort of like, okay, like I know you're worried. What are you worried about? And then let's look at what we can maybe control and what we can't. I think, and it's interesting. I may be going with my own stuff a little bit, but I know I'm highly anxious for my child to be successful at university and finally if he's 17 and looking at going. And it was interesting to him wrestle with what he was worried about going or not, because he was like, should I take a year off? Is that causing a problem? What if I go into the wrong program? What if I get there and it can't work? What if I have to go to another city and I don't know anybody? What if I decide to move with my girlfriend and to her university, and then I can't afford to live there because I'm on a minimum wage job? That, by the way, sent my anxiety, just because I was like, I kept it on the inside, but I'm like, that was an option. Um, and it was interesting talking it through with him about just part of it was sort of going, it's okay if this doesn't work out the first time, we will figure it out. Um, Sometimes knowing that a consequence isn't going to be the end of the world can be very reassuring for kids. With that being said, I got to tell you, the pandemic has been a huge stressor and online learning is tough out there. So that's a reasonable fear.
Yeah, for sure. There's lots of questions about online learning. How do you calm your own anxiety in the moment as an adult in order to help a child?
So for
Great
example, how
question.
did I keep my inner like, what do you mean you're moving in with your girlfriend in another city? Why am I just hearing about this now? How do I keep that on the inside? How do we do that? Um, so a lot of what works for what we're going to teach our kids, we'll sort of have to master ourselves first. So part of it is putting in a little bit of time to sort of know what it is about that situation that makes us anxious, and noticing for ourselves, like tracking, like I know my physical symptoms for when I'm getting anxious. And I try to pay attention to them. And so it's being aware, like, oh, I'm starting to elevate. How can I calm down? And so part of that is practice and work, just sort of like, okay, this conversation makes me nervous. Another thing can be is I try not to parent in isolation. And the tough thing is when you're dealing with an anxious thing with your own child, you can't really talk over your fears often with your child about it. Even if they're teenagers, there's sort of a limit to what you can discuss. So sometimes being able to talk through your worries with another supportive adult who, ideally, a partner, another interested adult in that kid's life, a confidant, sometimes that can help us learn to deal and process with our own anxiety about that before we actually have to sit down and manage it with the kid. Like anything else, it's always easier done if we've prepared than if suddenly they spring something on us. And bless them, children will always spring something on us. But that would be my quick, off the cuff thoughts on that.
All right. Is there a resource for grade 12 students heading to university to help them with their mental health and the transition to university? While you speak to that, Jory, I'm going to pop the link to our sister program, Mental Health Literacy, in there, the Know
Sweet.
Before You Go module.
That's an
Yeah.
excellent resource, actually. Um, I actually struggle with thinking of a better resource than that one that was just mentioned. So here's one of the lovely things about going to any university. Um, the student union's fees that all kids pay, they cover a host of benefits, many of which are not actually ever accessed. Um, Now, the student advisors and the student health center that are a part of any campus, they provide supports in that area. Universities are very familiar with kids that bobble when they arrive because it's sort of normal. A lot of 17, 18, 19-year olds bobble when they're first independent and struggle. So my first thing that I suggest is you can call the university and see what's already there. Your child can start exploring that. My child's already been talking a bit with their designated, their school happens to have a designated mentor with that. So yeah, I'd start to see with what they're already paying to get.
All right, and another question here. How do I deal with a child who gets so angry that they throw things at their teachers?
That is a hard one because what's happening is you've got safety being involved. Um, see, so where I would normally start with something like that is I would start by looking at um, analysis. What are the antecedent events that tend to lead to that? Another thing that I would do is I'm a big fan of Ross Green's model, collaborative problem solving, um, because the assumption of that model, and if you could look up, for instance, the explosive child goes to school. He's also got a website, livesinthebalance.org. And all his stuff on that is easily accessible, and he's got a his organization has a big belief in just getting the information out there. They're not my experience is there hasn't been a charge anytime I've been using them. A big part of his model is you're looking at behavior as a skills deficit. So it's trying to identify what is the lagging skill for that kid that is giving them that issue of poor emotional regulation. And the reason I like this approach is if you can identify the skill deficit that's there, that often leaves you with ideas about, okay, how can I help them develop that skill? Another premise of the collaborative problem solving model is kids do well if they can. Like that child probably doesn't get up in the morning and go, you know what, I want to go in and throw something at my teacher. That's probably not how they want things to go. They're probably unhappy by the end because it probably creates some consequences for them. Um, and if you identify that lagging skill and have ideas around um, how you can help that child develop that skill, that often leaves you in a much better place than going, well, the child has anger issues, or uh, the child has had a bad upbringing, or the child has a short fuse, or the child has uncontrolled ADHD. The problem when you get to a place like that is often there's not an intuitive solution from any of those labels. Say, for the sake of argument, it's like, oh, the child has out of control ADHD, and there's just not an option of any form of treatment for it. Well, if you end up staying at that spot, you're sort of dead in the water because there's no solution. Whereas if it's this child has a very short fuse that can be traced back to they have a tremendous trouble easily making transitions. They don't switch attention well at all. Okay, how can I help support them learning how to transition their attention? Um, at the end of the day, you have to go with safety. I mean, the teacher and the child both have to be protected. I'm realistic that sometimes behaviors for some children can overwhelm the ability of any one teacher to deal with them. So there might be a need of more support. But I'm also aware that every school is limited by the resources that they have to bring to bear. I guess the final thought for that is I wonder how the teacher's dealing with that, because that again that fits with, well, how do you support teachers? Um, that's probably at the end of the day a teacher that might need a little extra support because they're dealing with extra stress.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. There are many questions that have come in asking if the More module is free. Yes, it is. Just be sure to register for the module. All of the modules are free for More as they are for CES. Thank you very much, Jory, for your time this evening. If questions weren't answered, please forward them to CES at AHS, and we'll do our best to answer them for you. Lots of accolades coming in, Jory. Thank you very
Oh,
much.
well, and
Thank you
thank
for
you so
putting the
much for
words in my
giving me
mouth. Yeah, lovely.
thank thank you so
Thank you
much for
very
giving me
much.
your time this evening. Um,
Thank you.
yeah.
And thank you everyone who joined us. Thank you for supporting CES. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Take care all.